Welcome back to episode 5 of Novelio. Today is Thursday, April 29th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun by Jessica Russell. Her heart was beating fast, and she glanced back at the looking-glass, noticing that it was quite old. It was beautifully wrought and featured a heavy gilt frame, and the glass was a bit mottled. It had likely been made a century ago. That was certainly what caused her to think Carinsa's face had become distorted. Shortly the door opened again, and Catherine was relieved to find Robert standing before her, looking ecstatically happy. "I am so proud of you, love," he said, and she could see genuine admiration shining from his eyes. "But I felt like a stammering fool," she cried. "No, sweetheart, not at all. You are as composed and refined as any lady in England. Not that I have ever had any doubt. But I am proud and delighted with how you handled what we knew would be at the very least uncomfortable. You won them all over." "I have won Julian over?" Catherine asked dryly. "Oh, don't worry about him." Robert dismissed her trepidation with a wave of his hand, and still smiling said, "Let's go see my father." "At once?" "Yes, before dinner. I don't want to wait a minute longer. He will adore you." Catherine never ceased to wonder at Robert's outlook on life and his determination to see everything positively. Indeed, it seemed he often made good things come to pass by simply believing they would. "You should never look on the dark side," he had said on more than one occasion, "or you can be sure that fate will turn it in your direction." Robert secretly had a seamstress at work on Catherine's trousseau, and that night had a dinner gown ready for her. It was made of soft cream-colored muslin and was breathtakingly simple. It was gathered by an embroidered deep red sash and hung loosely from her waist to flow out in soft waves. It left her shoulders bare, as was the latest style, and accentuated her graceful figure, giving her an innocent, waif-like appearance. Her gleaming hair was pulled back from her face in soft waves and caught with a ribbon of the same shade as the sash. It was Sarah who had helped her to dress, and Catherine noticed she was very clever with hairstyles and fashions. After Catherine was ready, Sarah disappeared, and the couple then made their way down the hall to Lord Bradshaw's room. "Come closer, child," he said after Robert introduced her. "Here, sit on the edge of the bed and let me get a good look at you. Now who are you and what is this all about?" Catherine smiled broadly, already liking the old man, and sat there very comfortably looking down at him. "I have married your son, Robert, which may displease you," she said without ceremony. "Good heavens! An elopement in the family? You have a beauty here, son, the likes of which I've never seen before." Catherine smiled up at Robert, but then continued, "Ah, but you have seen me before, Lord Bradshaw, at my father's blacksmith shop. I am from the village. My name before marriage was Trefellner." "One of Blake's girls?" the older man exclaimed. "Grown into the most beautiful women in England. I'm not surprised that my son swept you away before someone else did. You must be glad to be free of that old wretch. What a poor argument for becoming a Puritan, eh?" "Father," Robert said, but Catherine smiled, looking from her husband to his father in astonishment. "I must say you have given me the best welcome of anyone in the family. I'm afraid perhaps your mind is momentarily unclear," she said, sensing she could joke with him in this manner. "Not a bit of it. I have all my mental faculties. Do you think I did not notice the way the twins behaved whenever we stopped at the smithies? But I did not know you have grown in even more lovely than when I took those rides with my boys. The family probably thinks you're a schemer," and he laughed heartily. "And how come you be sure I am not?" Catherine replied, smiling. "Easily. Robert is the best judge of character there ever was, and would never marry unless it was for the love of a good woman. I also note that you have not a bit of village accent. Were you educated then, child?" Catherine received the best education before her father decided it was evil for a woman to learn, Robert said. Last year she was even governess to William and Eleanor Harrison. "You did a good thing here, Robert. I think she is splendid." Catherine smiled at her husband in both happiness and utter disbelief. Of all the scenarios she worked out in her mind, this was not one of them. If she had the approval of the reigning lord of the manor, did it matter what anyone else thought? Although he was old and obviously ill, he was still lord of the estate. She felt her anxiety lift significantly for the first time. Surely the others would warm to her as well. Probably not Julian, but she cared little for that. If the ladies began to like her and Robert's father was happy, it was enough. She realized then that Robert had orchestrated this visit immediately so that they could go on from there with what he guessed correctly would be his father's approval. Julian had refused to eat with them and was off somewhere, and for this Catherine was grateful. She couldn't imagine the discomfort of sitting at a table with a man who had been trying to seduce her only days before she wed his brother. Inevitably, they would all have to live together, but she was pleased to be spared that added awkwardness on this night. I wish there had been time to have cook plan a better meal, Carinza said, and Catherine realized that Carinza was in charge of such things. Well, naturally she was. As the only female of the household, she briefly wondered if it would upset her to be usurped by Catherine. Nevertheless, she knew at least that part would work out satisfactorily, as she avoided conflict at virtually any cost. If Carinza wished to continue with such duties, Catherine would step aside in a subtle way and not make an issue of it. She knew Robert would certainly not care, and she could hardly imagine Julian involving himself with domestic matters, although she did have to admit to a certain curiosity regarding how Carinza handled the rather forward Sarah on a day-to-day basis. "Oh, but this is wonderful," Catherine replied, speaking of the roasted meat and potatoes that were served with delicious herbs, some of which she could not place. She learned later that Carinza had her own still room and herb garden, and was very interested in the use of plants and spices, not only as food, but also for medicinal purposes. She remarked that the ale was also brewed perfectly, not too strong, but with just enough bite. "It is all so sudden," Jennifer said. "I can hardly believe that you and Robert will be in Italy shortly." "Was that my brother's idea, or yours?" she asked with interest. "I must admit it was mine," Catherine said. "Well, Robert will be an excellent guide, as he has been there several times, and will know exactly where to take you to make it most memorable." Catherine responded and thought to herself how pleasant it was for Jennifer to treat her as if she were a neighbour they had known all their lives, instead of a partner to a rather shocking escapade no one expected. Jennifer was a very pragmatic woman, and realized at once that what was done, and there could be no virtue in making Catherine feel uncomfortable in her new surroundings. "I think Julian will rant and rave enough for the entire family. We might as well attempt to keep peace," Richard had said as they dressed for dinner. In truth, they were both a bit suspicious, but each had to admit to an intense curiosity about this girl and her impressive dignity and intelligence. "There's a lot more than there that meets the eye, I think, but in a good way," Jennifer had replied. "Or perhaps I am just being naive." "Well," Richard had answered, "Robert doesn't have a gullible bone in his body, so I can hardly envision him ensnared by a schemer. Perhaps it is just one of those odd matches that come about from time to time. If it isn't as if he was obliged to marry an heiress," he added with a laugh. This was true, as the excellent management of Briarwood and its rich lands had made Justin Bradshaw a wealthy man, and everyone on the estate prospered. A woman with a substantial dowry was therefore not an overly important matter for either twin. Robert did say that our father was very open to it, and I suppose, if that's the case, we shouldn't worry overly much. Although both Richard and Jennifer were not quite as blasé about the matter as they pretended, it was impossible for anyone to be indifferent to Catherine after meeting her, and they both wanted to learn more about this unusual girl. "It must feel a bit overwhelming to come to a royalist household," Carinza said, "especially from a staunchly Puritan home. Are they every bit as strict as they appear?" There was a brief, clumsy silence at the table, resembling the one that had occurred earlier and for similar reasons, but Catherine quickly found her tongue and explained how such households were run. "Well, I don't know exactly what you may have heard, but life in a Puritan home is indeed severe and oppressive. I remember a bit of laughter and light-heartedness when I was a girl, although my father was always extremely religious. I am, of course, a Christian woman, but I cannot find much evidence in the Bible to back up the fanatical beliefs to which Puritans cling. My father, on the other hand, rapidly changed once the movement began and was not only ardent in his religious philosophies, but also in his belief that all must change to embrace these new teachings. It is true that any pleasure is considered sinful, and even laughter is in most cases restricted. To laugh on the Sabbath would earn me a day without food. Clothing must be as drab as possible, and even the flowers that I love so much are considered sinful, as they serve no practical purpose. If you love flowers, then you shall love the gardens here, put in Richard, realizing, as everyone else had by then, that she was a highly educated young woman. Jennifer has a lovely gardens herself back at the Grantley estates, but I don't think anything competes with what Carinza has created at Briarwood. Carinza instantly colored and thanked Richard for the compliment. She was far more susceptible to compliment about her herbs and flowers than her looks, and despite what she said, she was good-looking. Catherine immediately warmed to Richard for working in the compliment for this young relative of Robert's. "Why such a grim outlook, though?" Robert asked. "I have never understood it. Surely if God wanted flowers only to be practical, he would not have made so many that served no other purpose than to decorate a garden. According to my father and most Puritans, those things are on earth to tempt us and make us probe our own weaknesses. Even fancy buttons on clothes are considered an extravagance that only a wicked person would find appealing." "I've always found the whole concept very strange," said Robert. "Where does it say in the Scriptures that we are not to enjoy anything?" "That I could never discover," said Catherine, "and I have done much Bible reading in my life. Unfortunately, my father I came up with more questions than answers. I find few verses to back up his fanatical beliefs." "Well, your whole life has certainly changed now," Jennifer said. "But tell me, does your mother share your beliefs, or your father's?" Robert immediately began to speak in order to save Catherine from having to broach a painful subject. "Unfortunately, Catherine's mother passed away several months ago. She made Catherine swear to go on with our plans and not spend months in mourning. Of course, that is much easier said than done when one is bereaved, but Catherine has been strong, and would have made her mother proud." Catherine, who had quickly composed herself, turned to Jennifer and said, "And my mother, God rest her soul, did not share my father's extreme philosophies, something for which I will always be grateful." "Losing a loved one is always difficult," said Richard, after the others expressed their perfunctory condolences. "But it must comfort you to know that she shared your belief in a loving God." "Yes," Catherine replied. "She saw very little value in any religion that teaches us to worship God, but be unkind to those he created." Later that night, Catherine wondered if Carinza was truly curious about the Puritan way of life, or had asked those questions to once again highlight the fact that Catherine married far above what would be considered her station. At any rate, she felt she could charm away her resentment, and was glad the dinner had gone nicely, and that she was relieved of Julian's presence on this first evening. "You're too beautiful to be real, Cat," Robert said later, as she emerged from her dressing room in a flowing lilac nightdress. He handed her a glass of wine, and they shared a toast. "I have been waiting all day for our own toast. It's not the same when it is with the entire family. I am still wondering why God chose to make me the most fortunate man in England, but I shall not question it." Catherine laughed, and thought that her husband's smile was the most beautiful thing God ever made. "But, Robert, I know so little of these matters. Will you be patient with me? You have nothing to worry about, love. Be your sweet and maddening self, and the rest will go along naturally, I promise." He was concerned that perhaps her father's constant talk of wrath and hellfire would warp her perception of love between a man and a woman, but was happily surprised at how willingly she came to him, and how passionate her response. The covers were turned down on the bed, and he had swept her off her feet with a flurry of kisses, caresses, and laughter. If she had thought being with him to that point was paradise, she was not prepared for the ecstasy she felt when they finally came together as man and wife. She couldn't believe how completely the two of them could become one, despite differences in experience, upbringing, or expectation. Nothing could pull them apart as they moved in instinctive harmony, every sense alive to kiss and touch in those simple moments. Nothing else mattered. He was completely satisfied with her, and was mesmerized how she drank in every caress as a cold garden drinks in sun. Afterward he idly played with her long silky hair, thanking God for this woman he knew was the only one for him. "I shall never tire of her as long as I live. As she lay against him, her hair strewn across his chest, limbs entwined, listening to the night birds and smelling the heather from the vases in the room, she thought it all reflected her perfect contentment. Nothing mattered except that they were now husband and wife. She wanted the moment to last forever, thinking that she never felt so loved, safe, and cared for in her life. As if reading her thoughts, he stirred and pulled her to him, his love-making now as demanding as it had been gentle. He had quickly realized she held a raging passion underneath her composed demeanor, and it pleased him indescribably. Later, Catherine studied her husband's face in the moonlight. He is the most handsome man God ever made, she thought, and then laughed at herself, thinking how much in love she was. The first sign of dawn was streaking the sky, and she crept over to the window seat to watch the sunrise. She still worried about the family, but was relieved that Lord Bradshaw had no objection to her. Julian was another case altogether, but since he could hardly order Robert around, she worried less about him than the women, with whom she would likely spend a significant amount of time. It was wonderful to think of living in the manor now, having enough to eat, warmth in the winter, and no more exhausting chores that her health made it difficult to complete to her father's satisfaction. If there was such a state for the man, always a lover of nature, she looked over the rich meadows and fields that surrounded the home and couldn't wait to be shown the grounds and meet the people who made their living on the property. Her only sadness was that her mother was not alive to share her joy. Suddenly exhausted, she climbed back into bed.